doing this event on today and giving me the opportunity to talk to you about my research. Research, I will add, that was made possible by 2 History Associates travel crews, so thank you so much. The work that History Associates does for graduate students is really incredible and really helps us along in our process. And so hopefully you can see some of your good work has helped to produce today. So today my presentation will focus on the research of my first dissertation chapter entitled Selling Self-Discovery, Constructing a Desire for Female Travel in Post-War Japan. The guiding desires of my larger, broader dissertation title, guiding differences in desires, if you will, focusing on the desire part today. So first I will discuss how travel in post-war Japan became a gendered phenomenon by exploring how the travel industry and the media, specifically the magazine industry, constructed and sold a desire for travel to young Japanese women. Throughout the 1970s and into the 1980s, the number of Japanese women traveling abroad surged. In 1971, about 230,000 women embarked on foreign travel. 2 years later, in 1973, the amount doubled, surpassing 500,000. By 1979, the number of women traveling abroad surpassed 1 million and increased throughout the 1980s, such that by 1984, the number close to 1.6 million. In the last year of the Showa period, 1988, over 3.2 million women had traveled abroad that year. Although the majority of Japanese travelers continue to be men, examining travel and tourism from a perspective that centers women and femininity reveal key facets, structures, and processes about post-war Japanese society. It is also a fruitful site to examine how Japanese women came to know and interact with the broader world within and beyond the borders of the Japanese state. For some, these initial excursions in the form of tourist travel led to more permanent moves outside of Japan. A common trend among Japanese immigrant women who arrived after 1965 was going abroad as a tourist or on a student exchange program, usually to the US, but sometimes to other destinations like Europe, before migrating to the West. These short-term, temporary forays abroad served as stepping stones to a more long-term move to the United States. Some of the women I conducted oral history interviews with described making connections on these short-term trips that provided them the impetus to move, like meeting a romantic partner or developing friendships. These travels were not necessarily pivotal moments of epiphany, the sole reason that these women chose to migrate, as many of these women already possessed an interest in American popular culture or a desire to expand their horizons in terms of careers or social relationships before their trips. However, these travel experiences, rather than hampering or completely fulfilling these ambitions, stroked them, leading to the more permanent step of migration. In order to understand this connection between women, migration, and travel, I will illustrate how the travel industry created meanings for and about gender. In doing so, I examined travel media and form of travel features in women's magazines, travel magazines themselves, travel manuals, and guidebooks. Although the modern Japanese industry traces its roots to Japan's imperial period during the first half of the 20th century, the travel of Japanese citizens was heavily restricted during World War II and the subsequent American occupation and throughout the 1950s. The Japanese government tightly controlled Japanese travel abroad in order to develop the Japanese economy. They encouraged inbound foreign travelers and the spending that such travelers brought, while restricting international travel and spending abroad of Japanese citizens. In order to maintain a surplus and a balance of payments in the travel sector, the Japanese government required Japanese travelers to obtain approval from the Ministry of Finance Committee, which often issued passports that were only valid for a single trip abroad. The government did not consider tourism a legitimate reason for travel. Furthermore, they instituted a limit on how much money Japanese travelers could carry out of the country. As Japanese economic growth increased during the the Japanese government implemented new measures allowing Japanese citizens to travel abroad for tourism starting in 1964. However, they only increased the, quote, maximum foreign exchange acquisition for tourist purposes from $0 to $500 per year, making tourism a limited option financially. However, 2 years later, in 1966, the government raised this amount to $500 per trip. This policy change, paired with several other factors, including rising disposable incomes and the creation of packaged tours, made travel much more accessible to the average person in the 1970s, creating a boom in Japanese travel and travel marketing. Oops, guess my slides got out of order. This is the imperial era of travel. So, a significant change in the post-war era was the courting of a new consumer base, women. Japanese women rapidly moved into salaried employment throughout the 1960s and 1970s. However, most of these women occupied part-time positions, or positions considered more menial, positions like have more flexibility to take time off. This came to the attention of the travel and media industries, like Japan Travel Bureau, the largest travel ad agency in Japan, which saw in women a new profitable base of consumers. Simultaneously, magazine companies also began targeting the same demographic, young women in their late teens and early 20s. Two of the premier magazines that emerged at this time and are credited with creating the phenomenon of women's travel are Anhan and Nonon. Anhan began a publication in 1970 and Nonon a year later in 1971. Although Japanese women had traveled to various places around the world in the pre-war imperial era, particularly for the purposes of immigration and Southern colonialism, it was not until the 1970s that women's travel became a named phenomenon. This is in part what makes an examination of the travel of Japanese women in the 1970s so interesting. It was a recognized, highly publicized phenomenon in Japanese media and Japanese popular consciousness. The fact that women's travel constituted a phenomenon is evidenced by the coined term annonzoku, used to describe a generation of women in their late teens and 20s associated with this boom in gendered travel. Annonzoku is derived from combining the names of these two women's magazines. You stick them together, you got Anno. One article, so in the slew of 1970s nostalgia that has welled up in the wake of 50-year anniversaries starting in 2020, annonzoku have reemerged in public discourse. One article captures the popular image of annonzoku with the following description: the figure of women traveling around Japan with these magazines with the latest fashion and travel information tucked under their arm. These two magazines were key in establishing the norms of women's culture in the 1970s. They presented and advertised mass-produced, ready-made, off-the-rack fashion rather than sewing patterns, as the prior generation of fashion magazines did, donned by stylish models via the new style of full-page, glossy spreads. Under their definition, fashion came to be more than what one wore or how one dressed. Shueisha, the publishing house that put out Nonon, described it like this: fashion was considered to be the key word of the times that governed all aspects of young women's lifestyles, from food, clothing, shelter, love, marriage, travel in the city, to information on both material and spiritual matters, which could then be measured and planned according to whether they were in fashion, in, or lagging behind, out. The implication and proposition was that fashionable clothes only come to life when they are worn in the bistros and discos, roppongi, or the travel destinations of Paris and Tokyo. According to these magazines, fashion included and encompassed who a woman was and how she expressed herself, how she lived, talked, ate, what she knew, what activities she did, what experiences she had, including where she had traveled. Thus, the magazine pages offered advice on how to become fashionable through one's lifestyle, like their interior design choices, and also travel to. However, travel in particular was included in Nonnon for more ideological purposes as well. Some editorial staff promoted the idea of expanding the life experiences available to women as they promoted travel, and they promoted travel as one way to do so. Okawa Kuniyuki, a prior associate editor at Nonnon in the 1970s and 1980s, explained to me in an oral history interview that at the time, traveling, well, it's an act of breaking away from daily life, to go out into a different world, isn't it? And in the case of women in particular, all they had were outings and a school trip. Well, I mean, in truth, men also did not travel very much, I think. But if you go out, you can experience all sorts of things and meet people who are different from the people you are used to. You learn so much about the world at large. And I've always wondered why Japanese people don't do such things more actively. And this is an indispensable part of the Nonnon concept. The editor-in-chief at the time agreed with me, and this was an important aspect of the magazine, and it was an important point in Nonnon. However, we also felt that it was important for young women in particular to get out of the house and take action. So we began to introduce more and more trips other than school excursions, and we developed the concept of travel. As I mentioned earlier, I think one of the major roles of this magazine is to create opportunities for women to get out of their homes and into nature and the wide open sky and the people who live under it. I think it's a way of liberating them from their homes. I think you could call it that, from the home. As Okawa illustrates in his recounting of why travel features were included in Nonnon, there was an ideological underpinning to travel's inclusion that extended beyond the mere fact that travel was fashionable or a money grab for the state and travel industry. From the perspective of the editorial staff creating the magazine, travel was a way to, quote, liberate women and get them out into the world to gain experiences as well as meet a variety of people. It is important to think about and contextualize Okawa here in order to understand why and from where this position on this subject arose. Okawa graduated from one of Japan's most premier private universities, Waseda University, well known for its dealings in liberalism and liberal thought, both before World War II and after. In the 1950s and 60s, many Waseda alumni became politicians, including Liberal Democratic Party politician Tanzan Shibashi, became prime minister in 1956. Moreover, at the end of the 1950s, following American models, Waseda University administrators began showing interest in and strengthening ties with private industries. Although liberalism had existed in Japan before World War II, the dominant narrative of post-war reform disseminated by American occupation forces thrust discussions of a specific form of liberalism and democratization at the center of post-war Japanese discourse, particularly in conversations around women and gender. This heavily American-influenced form of liberalism emphasized the concepts of the individual and the freedom to pursue one's individual desires and choices in various realms of social life in order to reform Japan as a democratic nation. It is worth noting that Japan was a constitutional democracy since the Meiji era and the enactment of the Meiji Constitution in 1889. The American occupation forces used reforms of the Japanese Constitution, which included stating equality of the sexes, to legitimize their presence in Japan. They portrayed themselves as intervening in backwards, feudalistic Japanese society to bring about democracy through freeing of supposedly oppressed Japanese women. Historians and feminist scholars of Japan, however, have illustrated the ahistorical dimensions and limitations of this politically driven narrative. The Meiji state, though still excluding women from certain forms of participation, viewed women as a valuable public economic asset in their role as good wives and wise mothers. Their conception of women did not categorize them as fragile and in need of protection, nor did they believe women should be relegated to the private sphere, as certain conceptions of American motherhood did. Rather, they mobilized them for state purposes through this prescribed role. Thus, gender relations and patterns were organized differently in Japan, without the public-private dichotomy central to gender relations and the formation of liberal feminist movements in the US and Europe. However, Okawa's post-war perception that women needed freeing from the home can be explained by the hegemonic dominance of occupation-era discourses of women's liberation through democratizing reforms. US occupation officials indicated to Japanese film studios that they should depict and highlight, quote, individual initiative and enterprise, solving the post-war problems of Japan in industry, agriculture, and all phases of the national life, and, to quote, encourage respect for the rights of people as individuals. Thus, such emphasis on individualism and individual agency trickled into the media and popular discourse circulating at the time when Okawa was growing up in Japanese society. Okawa's emphasis on the, quote, liberation of women from the home through the experience of the individual, i.e. travel, gestures to how these larger conversations of liberalism, broadcast in higher education and the media, seep in and influence his perspective and future objectives as the editor at UCSB. However, liberalism was not the only camp of thought Okawa came into contact with during his time at Waseda. Toward the end of his time, Okawa participated in the 1965 Waseda student strike, a precursor to a more widely known student protests of 1968 and 1969. The 1965 Waseda student strike, or Soldai Koso, was fomented from students' dissatisfactions and disillusionments over rising tuition fees, the school's management of a second student center, which it finished constructing in 1965, and the aforementioned move by university administrators to create partnerships with private industry. The most prominent group to lead the movement on Waseda's campus was the Kakumaru, the revolutionary Marxists. Thus, a mixture of ideologies, debates, and conversations were swirling around the Waseda campus at the time of Okawa's attendance, from the liberal teachings in some professors' classrooms to the more communist, socialist-leaning discourses circling among the student organizers. Okawa's educational background and participation in the student strike, as well as the larger social context surrounding the intersections of women, shed valuable light on his political positions and values. Rooted in a liberal progressive perspective, Okawa sought to use his role as a media producer and editor at UCSB to help expand the horizons of Japanese women and impact Japanese society. It is important to note that his definition of liberation took the form of enticing individual women into public spaces and activities. Freedom, in the mind of Okawa, took on the meaning of exercising individual choice and autonomy aligned to a liberalist definition of empowerment. One avenue for this, from his perspective, was encouraging women to travel, and thus this messaging became embedded on the pages of UCSB. The norms established by UCSB disseminated to other publications. Thus, travel became a common feature in women's magazines at the time. Fashion and travel became so interlinked that JTB, Japan's largest travel agency, launched its own travel-focused women's magazine, WWII, in 1973. You see how they derived their name from WWII, how they asobu, look, see, eat, and play. So it gives you an idea of what message about travel they're putting out there. The Japanese tourism and magazine industry sold and promoted travel to Japanese women by emphasizing that travel was a moment where women could concentrate on, improve, indulge in, and discover themselves. This narrative was most explicit when paired with the idea of hitorikari, or solitary travel or solo. The first issue of JTB's women-oriented magazine, WWII, exemplifies this. A feature article promoting Kobe, full of stunning photos of Kobe's architecture and sites, punctuated with young, fashionably dressed female models, reads as follows. Kobe is a town that suits being alone. Even if there is a handsome some suntanned man by your side, it is better to be alone. It is a town where the sound of the steps is clear. I play the sound of the pavement with my heels. It is a cute sound I have forgotten. It follows me always, like a little white dog. It is a town where I meet another me. The scene this article sets is of an enticing but solitary trip, a trip where all that accompanies the woman traveler is the sound of her own footsteps. These magazines presented travel as the opportunity for a woman to step outside the confines of norms, particularly gender norms. On the second page of the spread, the poem asks its reader to imagine another scene. Can you believe it, ladies? You, walking down the street, boldly, audaciously, with an ice cream bar in hand. The act of eating and walking, characterized as bold or audacious by the author, and therefore placed outside mainstream feminine norms, is only available to the woman traveler in the space of travel, particularly solo travel. It is no coincidence that this bold act of eating and walking is paired with the earlier description of a quiet, solitary environment, where one's only companion is the click-clacking of their own heels. Such bold transgressions can only take place outside the purview of prying eyes. Although there may be people around, after all, the way it is a city, those eyes do not belong to the people the woman traveler knows or sees in her daily life. She is protected by her anonymity. The idea of transgressing certain norms is also exhibited in WWII's fashion column, which ran for 5 issues between the summer of 1973 and the summer of 1974. WWII's fashion column characterizes travel as a place for a woman to play with reinventing herself, specifically through clothes and accessories she chooses to wear. The article encourages its readers to try switching up their normal style while on a trip, writing, if you usually sport a boyish look, switch it up and try wearing a long, fluttering, full-floor skirt at your travel destination. You may be able to discover a side of yourself you don't normally see. It continues stating, it takes courage to try new fashion, but travel gives you courage. Here, explicitly, the magazine encourages women to discover a different side of themselves or a new self entirely through the donning of different styles while traveling. In fact, as presented by this article, travel is a key facilitator for this self-discovery. It provides the time and space for a woman away from those of her ordinary day-to-day to consider herself, what she is normally like, who she would like to be, what new style she would like to try. Travel is the setting for the woman traveler to accomplish her true aim, as put forth by the article, to meet an alternative version of herself. In doing so, these magazines encourage women to focus and center themselves, to enact their own desires. Such ideas ran counter to dominant narratives of femininity post-Japan, particularly those associated with familial roles. Other feminine ideals of the time encouraged women not to prioritize herself or her desires. Rather, her desires and choices were dictated by the external world around her. She looked outwards at the needs of others, like her husband, or her children, or her community, not inward at her own. Although feminine norms of self-consideration and self-centralization put forth by travel media might seem at odds with more mainstream norms of self-sacrifice and prioritizing the needs of others, these two narratives coexisted symbiotically. Key to this coexistence was the sense of temporariness embedded in travel media's narrative of femininity. Many of the sources on women's travel imply that women's travel, the kind where she focuses on herself, is to take place in her youth. One of JP's earliest travel manuals for women, José no Camino do Volcán, published in 1961, states the following in an opening section to the guide. And when at the places you will go when you travel, the things you come and see will become etched into your heart. They, your experiences, will become memories you will never forget. They will forever mark the page of your position, your youth. The guide encouraged young women to have the formative experiences of travel, the moments that stay etched into your heart, and that you can look back on once you've moved onto another stage life. Moreover, any norms that a woman transgressed on her travels were also temporary as well. In the fall of 1973 issue of WWII, the magazine's fashion column promoted British-style fitted tailored suits with shirt jackets and blazers as the notable trend that fall. The author notes that this style and kind of tailoring is, quote, mannish. In emphasizing and categorizing this style as manlike, the article gendered this style and promoted a transgression of the gender line. In the prior decades of the 1950s and 1960s, androgyny, which subverted a clear gender binary, had been an issue of public concern. Such anxieties about androgyny were explicitly expressed in debates and public discourse about implementing co-education systems that would educate both genders together. One primary anxiety about co-education was the fear that it would lead to androgyny, namely the masculinization of girls and ruination. Androgyny produced such powerful concerns because it posed a powerful challenge to the binary system of gender, upon which social and economic structures, such as the corporate labor market, but also ideas of social custom and etiquette, were built. Thus, although providing an explicit promotion of crisscrossing the constructed gender binary in fashion, the writers and editors of WWII found a way to neutralize and maintain this fact, normalizing it and stripping it of any possibility of subversion. To accomplish this, they write, when a woman dresses manly or like a man, the motive is that she surprises and makes a big impact, accentuating and seeming very feminine when she changes back to wearing something feminine. Thus, the donning of mannish suits is brought back into the fold of acceptable gender behavior as decreed by the binary system. A woman dresses more akin to a man because it's more comfortable, she feels like it, or it's more expressive of a complex internal identity, but to bolster and accentuate her femininity. The article sets up an expectation that the suit-donning woman is to return to the proper side of the gender coin, femininity. Thus, just as donning a man's jacket on a trip did not pose a meaningful challenge to the system of gender, promoting women to focus on their own desires during travel did not outrightly pose a challenge to post-war dominant narratives of femininity. The narrative of women's self-consideration put forth by travel media was not a feminist proclamation. Any transgressions that might pose a challenge to the status quo, considering one's needs before others, dressing in more ostentatious or transgressive fashion, were promoted and prescribed as temporary, lasting only as long as a woman's youth and unmarried status. Moreover, this narrative served to uphold ideas of heteronormativity and Japanese cultural nationalism in particular ways, marking it as undoubtedly different from the critique of gender and Japanese national imperialism that Japanese feminists, known as women's view activists, waged and centered. Moreover, as I will turn to next in this talk, Japanese tourism, aided by this gender narrative, which helped propel Japanese women to travel, was embedded in several power structures that helped maintain geopolitical status quo. The Japanese woman traveler in the narrative of self-focused travel did not exist in a vacuum nor in a solely domestic space. Thus, I seek to think through how the woman traveler is entangled with larger processes in the world, as traveling itself is a process of transgressing borders and boundaries, be it municipal or international. Although there are many connections and entanglements that exist, I take a specific trans-Pacific perspective and purview as one possible example of the ways in which the Japanese woman traveler in tourism is immersed in larger processes. Japanese tourism has fed and facilitated the maintenance of American settler colonialism on America's Pacific Island colony of Guam. This comes in two forms: finances and products. Japanese investment and capital were present from the beginning of Guam's tourism development. However, more importantly, the patterns of Japanese tourism prompted and reorganized the type of tourism established on Guam. Guam has been and continues to be a major destination for Japanese tourism since the 1960s. Tourism was one of the reasons the United States began lifting entrance restrictions to the islands in 1962. During the Kennedy administration, American policymakers opened Guam due to growing inklings that tourism development could provide a means for U.S. territories in the Pacific to earn back foreign currency from foreign travelers and right the imbalance of payments. Although the initial primary target for Guam's tourism market was American tourists, in a research report submitted to Congress, Japanese, Australian, and local military markets were also identified as lucrative avenues for development. Thus, from the nascent planning stages of Guam's tourism industry, Japanese tourists were a key factor in consideration. Initially, Guam's government had concentrated on the development of longer-term stay resort tourism, modeled after Hawaii prior to World War II. However, the desire and demand of Japanese tourism and tourists prompted a change in the structure of Guam's tourism infrastructure. Japanese tourism norms altered and fueled Guam's tourism industry, helping America maintain its southern colonial colony both physically and economically. Japanese tourism on Guam started as memorial and war tourism. This pattern unfolded in part due to the kind of Japanese traveler that had the ability to leave Japan's borders in the 1950s and early 1960s. Those traveling for the purpose of memorial and bone collection of dead soldiers were one of the few kinds of travelers who could receive passports. Thus, the first Japanese travelers to Guam in the early 1960s were those paying respect to the dead. These were crucial steps in institutionalizing pipelines of Japanese tourism to the island. For example, traveling Japanese mourners needed accommodations on the island as they grieved and collected the remains of the dead. As war memorial tourism began laying the ground for tourism infrastructure, another group of Japanese travelers were turning their sights on Guam: honeymooners. Honeymooning became a significant kind of Japanese travel in the post-war period, both in its advent as well as in its influential cultural capital. According to Japanese sociologist Osamu Tada, the more honeymooners traveled somewhere, the more those places became favored by other Japanese tourists, including retirees, unmarried travelers, and families. Women's magazines were one key place where this kind of travel was marketed. Hawaii was held up and came to signify the preeminent honeymoon spot, the aspirational fantasy. And after the Japanese government liberalized overseas travel in 1964, international honeymoons to Hawaii became a legal option for young Japanese couples. However, high prices still proved obstructions to most. Guam, located closer to Japan with still massive tourism infrastructure, served as a much more affordable and accessible alternative until the mid-1970s, when Hawaii became a more tangible reality. Like war memorial tourists, honeymooners were coming to Guam for short stays, and thus, if Guam wanted to continue attracting these tourist markets, suitable tourism infrastructures, such as hotels catering to short-term visits, needed to be built. Japanese tourism participated in American Southern colonialism through its permanent occupying infrastructure and transient occupying bodies. Many of the hotels in Guam were constructed and operated by Japanese companies, with services offered in Japanese for the comfort and ease of Japanese tourists. Japanese companies were key in the physical construction of Guam's tourism infrastructure. For example, the first resort-style hotel on Guam was built in the early 1970s by a subsidiary of the Tokyu Corporation, which most famously owns Tokyu Railways in Japan. Although the hotel closed, Tokyu's construction company went on to build other Japanese capital tourism projects, including the golf course at the Hotel Mika Guam. Although the Japanese nation-state or Japanese agents do not govern the territory of Guam, they exert a degree of power that comes at the expense of the Chamorro indigenous population in Guam. The tourism industry and the presence of tourists who are predominant in Japanese consume and deplete precious resources such as water and electricity While the hotel district in Tumon Bay occupies less than 1% of the island's geographic space, compared to 30% occupied by US military bases, the 20 or so large hotels of this area consume as much water and electricity every day as the US military bases. Particularly during the high Japanese tourism seasons of Obon and Shogatsu for the New Year's holiday, water pressure in areas outside of the Tumon Bay hotel area and the American military bases becomes significantly weakened for the households who live in Guam, with a significant number of those households comprised of those remote descent. Japanese tourism was one key facet that shifted Guam's tourism to short-term stay patterns that also arose in Hawaii in the post-war period. The circulating streams of capital, which circle back to Japanese hoteliers, and tourist bodies obscure and drown the complicity of tourism as an institution, and even more so individuals to populate it. So I would like to end my talk today by elucidating how investigating and examining the formation of Japanese women's travel sheds light on how ideas of traveling are intertwined and entangled with larger power networks that connect and work across nations. Although these institutions and processes transgress physical national boundaries, they end up upholding and supporting other kinds of national boundaries and hierarchies related to global geopolitics, such as maintaining settler colonies throughout the Pacific and the world. Understanding these connections and processes can make us all more conscious of how our own social contexts construct desires for traveling and help us become more discerning and aware travelers and travel consumers. It can help us think critically about why we travel, where we travel to, and how we go about being a conscientious member of a shared world. Thank you.